As the team of 5 men and their dog sleds battled through howling winds and blinding snow, each step felt like a battle against the elements. Every second took them deeper into the unknown, where frostbite was a constant threat and death lurked beyond the next icy ridge. But they were getting closer to their goal, the South Pole. A place so remote and unforgiving that it was untouched and undocumented by man. But one question loomed over them. Where exactly was it? And would they be the first to conquer it? This is the true story of the insane race to the South Pole on this episode of Map Pack. It was the early 20th century, and the great unconquered frontier was looking rather conquered. The most remote areas of Earth were being visited by expeditions from the world's great empires, and many were being immediately colonized for resources. For those who viewed exploration as its own reward, the search was on for new frontiers, and there was no one more determined than Roald Amundsen. The Norwegian explorer was renowned for exploring polar regions. He was already famous for being the first to successfully traverse the Northwest Passage on the Gjoa on a mission that lasted from 1903 to 1906, and now he was ready for a bigger challenge. There were 2 great regions left to be conquered, the poles in the Arctic Circle and the Antarctic. Norway was tantalizingly close to the Arctic, so Amundsen set his eyes on conquering the North Pole, only to see this dashed not long after his return to Norway. American rivals Cook and Parry had already planted the Stars and Stripes at the pole, but not without controversy. Parry claimed to have reached the pole first, but Cook insisted that he had beaten him by nearly a year, sparking a fierce dispute. Amundsen was undeterred and immediately set his sights on the south. Antarctica was an even more remote goal and would require one of the longest sea voyages any exploration team had ever undertaken. This would likely be a multi-year, perilous mission with a high risk of death. But that had never stopped Amundsen before. When Amundsen explained his plans to his backers, many likely thought he had gone mad. Antarctica was known as the last frontier for a reason. It was a vast landscape of ice where death for the unprepared wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty. Spanning an astonishing 5.4 million square miles, Antarctica ranks among the largest landmasses on Earth, second only to modern Russia in size. And it's almost entirely frozen over, offering no refuge from the freezing cold, virtually no drinkable water, no shelter, and no supplies. There's little animal life too, except for penguins, seabirds, and aquatic mammals along the coast. But to find the South Pole, Amundsen and his crew would have to head far away from the coast and into a lethal trek that would challenge their endurance. So naturally, another crew decided, why not get in on the fun? Amundsen initially held off on explaining his full plans to his backers and the public, knowing they would think he was on a deadly fool's errand. Even as he fundraised, he was cagey about his destination. He didn't even tell his crew as he prepared. He chose his core crew among the most elite explorers of the age. Helmer Hansen played a crucial role in the Gjoa mission, demonstrating unmatched skill and resilience. Sverre Hassel, a seasoned dog sledder, brought invaluable experience from his time aboard the Fram during Amundsen's attempt to circumnavigate Greenland. Oscar Wisting was a decorated military veteran, while Olaf Bjaaland was a champion skier and highly skilled on the ice. They were joined by 14 shore crew, who would be spared the most intense part of the mission. But they had to hurry, because the world's largest empire at the time was on their trail. Robert Falcon Scott didn't just have possibly the most metal name in human history, the British Royal Navy officer was His Majesty's boldest explorer. He had previously set the furthest mark for exploring Antarctica, but had fallen short of the pole. He was determined to return to his nemesis and conquer that goal. And as 1910 dawned, the 42-year-old was ready to launch his own expedition. His own team trended more towards his military background, with Edgar Evans, Henry Robert Bowers, and Lawrence Oates all being fellow Navy chaps. They were joined by Edward Wilson, an explorer and natural historian who had previously worked with Ernest Shackleton. They were an elite team, ready to conquer the pole. But only one mission could succeed. In fact, the two could have worked together in another world. Explorers often forged alliances to take on difficult climates, and Scott had previously sent Amundsen key instruments that aided in his past expeditions, but Amundsen was treating this expedition with more secrecy than ever. He refused to even take Scott's call when the British explorer was in Norway to test new equipment, and so the two most ambitious explorers in the world would set out on an epic quest, one that could easily end in death for one or both parties. But not everyone was in on the plan. Amundsen had dramatically revised his plans after the Americans reached the North Pole, and he was heavily dependent on funding from the Crown and the Norwegian government to fund his mission. A South Pole expedition would be a huge risk, so he only wanted some key figures to know of it. The plan was for the mission to leave in August of 1910 aboard his famous Fram ship, and then head to the port of Madeira, its only port of call. It would then head due south to the Ross Sea in Antarctica. Now, he just had to tell the crew. While Amundsen's most critical team members knew the details of the mission, the shore crew on the ship didn't, and many were shocked that they were in for a much longer voyage upon leaving the Portuguese coast. Amund presented it as they were making a detour to the South Pole before the North Pole, and gave each man the choice to continue on or disembark. They all chose to proceed. After all, history was waiting. But there was one more person he had to inform of his plan. After all, all's fair in exploration. Why did Amundsen write a cable to Scott, letting him know they would be on the same path? Maybe it was friendly competition, or maybe he was hoping it would be an opening for cooperation. But at the same time, Scott had already set sail on his own ship, the Terra Nova. In addition to his core crew, he had a crew of 65 shore and ship staff, several of whom had been on past expeditions. He drew heavily on his allies in the Royal Navy, and his mission was looking more modern than Amundsen's at first glance. While Amundsen was relying heavily on the traditional northern transport method of dog sleds, Scott was a big fan of new technology and had planned to use motor sleds as well as ponies that had been used by Shackleton. But with new technology comes new problems. The motor sleds had been tricky to use and prone to breakdowns. The ponies were aging and might not be up to extended treks in the Antarctic freeze. Scott did have dog teams, but he was less than enthusiastic about their use. He did have two advantages on Amundsen's team: a head start, as he had set sail about 2 months before Amundsen, and territory in the southern hemisphere. The British Empire spanned the globe, and Australia was a very good staging point to launch their final mission to the South Pole. But both men shared a problem they didn't want to let on about. It took a lot of money to finance an expedition of this scale. Scott, who had previously been funded by the Royal Geographic Society, relied mostly on a combination of private funding and government grants for this mission. He continued to fundraise as he landed in British colonies along the way. Amundsen, meanwhile, had extensive support from the Norwegian government, but the much longer South Pole mission had been met with skepticism, both from the general public and its deep-pocketed donors. And on a mission like this, all that money could go up in a deep freeze. The first phase of the mission would go smoothly. After all, both men had been on long sea voyages before. The Fram sailed south for 4 months, mostly unaware of the hostile response they had been meeting back home. By New Year's Day 1911, they were seeing icebergs, and 2 weeks later, they had made it to the Bay of Whales in Antarctica. Scott, meanwhile, actually joined the Terra Nova after much of the voyage was complete, joining in South Africa and heading on to Melbourne and New Zealand. They took on new supplies at the end of November of 1910, but would immediately run into trouble, because Mother Nature might have been on Amundsen's side. The Terra Nova was heavily overburdened when it set sail, and a storm would soon hit, causing flooding on board and costing them valuable supplies. The ship lost 2 ponies, a dog, and much of their coal and petrol supplies. They didn't so much arrive in Antarctica as hit it, and were stuck in the southern pack ice for 20 days before being able to continue. This heavily ate into Scott's coal supplies. He was only able to continue as 1911 dawned, essentially letting Amundsen catch them. The race to the South Pole was on. The next challenge was to find a site for base camp in one of the most inhospitable landscapes in the world. The Fram had the easier task, having an orderly arrival in the pole with Amundsen picking a site about 4 kilometers from the ship. But there would be significant challenges to setting up the base that would be known as Framheim, transporting much of the ship's massive contents over the ice. 6 teams of dogs were needed to move the supplies, and the shore crew launched hunting expeditions and collected as many seals as they could to keep the crew fed long term. But they were about to get some unexpected company. It was February 3rd when the Terra Nova arrived in the Bay of Whales, having been blocked by the ice from their original destination. They were searching for a suitable approach when they discovered that they had been beaten by their Norwegian rivals. Still, civility won the day, with the two briefly visiting and sharing breakfast, and naturally taking back whatever intelligence they could get from the rival team. Although Amundsen offered the British team a spot alongside Framheim, it was rejected, and the Terra Nova crew returned to the sea around Antarctica to search for the proper starting point for their mission. It would be the start of 2 vastly different paths for the missions. Scott's crew would ultimately settle on Ross Island, in the bay he would name Cape Evans. The hope was that this area would remain free of ice in the summer, allowing the ship to come and go. A prefabricated accommodation had been constructed on the island, and their supplies were transported primarily by the ponies, who proved to be fantastic pack animals despite their advanced age. They then began the process of setting up a series of depots along the barrier on the edge to make it easier to find supplies and shelter as they began the main exploration. But then they had to wait. Because Antarctica was in the southern hemisphere, the seasons were reversed from what both men knew. The sun would set in April and not rise for the entire cold winter. Attempting to explore during this time would lead to certain death, so both men had planned to hunker down with the crew for the winter during the first season. Amundsen was careful to plan for the men to have something to do to avoid loss of morale, so the shore crew spent much of this month working on the sledges that would be used to make their way through the ice. Other tasks were preparing the rations for the journey and checking and improving the equipment. The men were on a special diet with berries and vitamin-rich bread, along with plenty of native meat, including penguins and seals, to keep them supplied with vitamins during the cold, dark months. And not far away, Scott and his men were following a similar plan. The Cape Evans hut would be home for the Terra Nova crew for several months, and in keeping with Scott's background, the whole affair had a more military vibe to it. The hut was subdivided, so the officers and crew were kept fairly separate, and the crew followed a strict schedule of scientific work and prepped for the race ahead. Scott was also very aware of the need for physical activity, both for the animals and the men. Games of football outside were common, and mental exercise was available in the form of lectures from the many experts on the mission. And then, slowly but surely, the sun began to rise. It would be Amundsen who would make the first move in early September as the temperature reached a brisk 68 below 0 Fahrenheit, or 56 below 0 Celsius. They kicked off with a brisk start, using dog-led teams to move 15 nautical miles, or 27 kilometers, a day. The men wore clothing made from insulated wolf and reindeer skin, and even that wasn't enough to keep from serious pain and trouble sleeping. When the dog's paws became frostbitten after only 4 days of travel, Amundsen realized he had made an error. The team built igloos for shelter, and Amundsen made the hard decision that they should return to Framheim. The return was a perilous affair, with several dogs dying. This led to a falling out between Amundsen and his close ally Hilmar Johansen over the timing of the attempt to the pole. The argument had been brewing since before they set out and escalated, leading to Johansen being removed from the polar party. It was a devastating setback, but would it open the door to Terra Nova's victory? Terra Nova had been facing challenges from terrain from the beginning, and that wouldn't stop now. The party had been split into several groups, planning a much more thorough exploration of the pole. The northern party faced serious troubles as the sea ice stymied their path, while western geological parties undertook 2 expeditions to map the massive area. Wilson had even led a winter expedition to Cape Crozier with Apsley Cherry Garrard and Henry Bowers, with the intention of obtaining some penguin eggs in an early state of incubation. This was a brutal mission, and was described by a crew member as the worst journey in the world. Scott, however, was pleased at the experiment, as it provided them with more information about the terrain at its worst, and they successfully returned with 3 eggs. But now, it was time for the main event. Scott would give his plans for the South Pole March on September 13, 1911, a little later than Amundsen. He was well prepared, sending out 16 men with motor sledges, dogs, and ponies heading to the Beardmore Glacier. But most wouldn't continue on to the pole. The goal would be to provide support and replenish depots for the return trip. As for the ponies, they would be shot for food along the way. This was harsh and unforgiving terrain, and Scott was not a sentimental man. But now, a mighty climb lay ahead. Scott kept motivation high, and people rather tense by not revealing who would be in the final polar party for much of the journey. The biggest challenge in their way would be the Beardmore Glacier, and this would start with 12 men, with Scott cutting 4 midway through and sending them back with the dog team. Ultimately, on January 3rd, 1912, they would reach a key point, and Scott would make his final cut, leading to the ultimate polar party of 5. There was just one problem. Scott had initially planned on a 4-man team tackling the pole, requiring recalculating of the key weights and rations. But Amundsen had been busy as well. It was a long, bitter month of calculating losses and making plans for the Norwegian explorer, and he didn't feel ready to leave again until October 11th. Now, with his final team of 5 polar explorers, they set out with 4 sledges and 52 dogs and immediately headed into a maze of frozen fog. They nearly met disaster when a sledge almost fell into a crevasse created by the depot team and took Amundsen with it, but a close call was averted, and so they made quick time, once again hitting their mark of 15 nautical miles or 27 kilometers a day. They marked their route using snow blocks every 3 miles. But they were now in uncharted territory. Scott had one key advantage. He was following Shackleton's route, but Amundsen didn't have access to that intel and had to find his own way through the Transantarctic Mountains. He spent several days exploring the foothills before finding a clear route, but they soon discovered it would be a challenging ascent with plenty of detours in the deep snow. They eventually made it to the glacier, about a month after setting out, with Amundsen giving much of the credit to his hardy dog team. Next up would be the hardest climb of the journey. The crew climbed over 10,000 feet, or just north of 3,000 meters, up the glacier, and now the final stage of the journey awaited. 45 of the dogs had survived to this point, and Amundsen made the choice to proceed with a team of 18, with the rest being killed for food. Those who returned from the mission described it as the hardest part of the mission, as these were loyal dogs who had been a key part of the mission. But survival was paramount here, and the men ate up and shared with the dogs before getting ready for the next stage of the mission. The glacier was the biggest obstacle. Both men had to conquer it, but who would be first? This next stretch would be the most brutal for Amundsen's crew. The smaller party with the remaining dogs loaded up their sledges and prepared for a hard march of close to 60 days. Bad weather delayed their initial departure time, and they had no way of knowing if someone else had beaten them in the desolate wilderness. As they soldiered on, they faced near death at every turn, as the icy surface was filled with sharp crevasses that were often hard to see in the blasting wind and fog. Every step could mean possible death, but they were about to enter the Devil's Ballroom. This was the name that Amundsen gave to an area where the crevasses were hidden by snow and ice. Each step was accompanied by an eerie hollow sound that indicated the area under them could break at any second. They eventually moved on to more solid ground, and they were within range of one of the most significant spots in the Antarctic, Shackleton's marker. The legendary explorer had called off his own mission before reaching the pole, but had left a marker of 88 degrees and 23 minutes. It was the furthest south anyone had ever traveled. When one of the teams saw that, They knew they were close. At this point, the two teams were on the lookout for any signs of their rival. A black flag in the white wilderness would mean failure, and Amundsen nearly had a heart attack when he saw something dark in the snow. But it turned out to be only dog droppings from their own team. So they soldiered on, knowing they were only days away from making history. And far away from their mark, making their own ascent, another team was getting close. It was January 9th when Scott's crew passed the famous mark of Ernest Shackleton. What seemed impossible was now very possible, and they soldiered on through devastating cold for another week. They were now less than 1 day away from achieving their destiny. And then, finally, they saw Roald Amundsen's black flag waving in the cold Antarctic wind. It had been December 14th, 1911, almost a month earlier when Amundsen's team had found the pole successfully, planted the Norwegian flag, and given it the name King Haakon VII's Plateau. They spent several days fixing the location of the pole for their records, and even left equipment for Scott to help their fellow explorer to get back before returning to Framheim over an extensive journey. The daylight was 24/7 during this period, so snow blindness was a danger, but by January 7th, they were arriving at their depots, and by January 30th, they were sailing back triumphant to Norway. But for Scott, it was a very different story. The loser of the epic race to the South Pole, Robert Falcon Scott, was now left alone with the enormity of the moment. He commented that the pole was an awful place to be when you weren't the first. He still hoped to be the first back to Australia to inform the world, so he planted the flag and his men began their journey home. But the men were quickly starting to run down, with several suffering from severe frostbite as they approached the glacier. Petty Officer Edgar Evans would be the first to die, from a combo of frostbite and injury from a fall near the bottom of the glacier. And things were about to go from bad to worse. They arrived at the barrier 3 days before the scheduled dog teams and found low fuel at the depots. Oates had been overcome by frostbite, his hands and feet essentially useless, and willingly chose to leave the tent and walk to his death to increase the team's chance of survival. As the remaining 3 marched on to a large depot, they were hit with a large blizzard, 11 miles or 17 kilometers from their destination. No one knows exactly what happened next, but Scott left a final diary entry detailing the relentless storm, found in what became their final resting place. One mission had ended in victory, the other in tragedy. It would be more than half a year before a successful mission would make it to the site where the men had perished, and a simple memorial would be erected to them. Oates' body was never found, as he had vanished into unknown wilderness. As news spread of Scott's death, the man was viewed as a tragic hero by the public, and few were willing to question the choices he made that led to this end. But in the late 20th century, books were published raising the idea that Scott may have been an inflexible authoritarian leader whose organizational skills were never questioned due to his military-style leadership. But for Amundsen, glory awaited. The Fram sailed on to Hobart, Tasmania, the site of the telegram location, and learned that there had been no news from Scott. This was March 7th, 1912, and no one yet knew of Scott's fate. He sent telegrams to his brother, his funders, and to the king, before immediately contacting the Daily Chronicle of London and selling the rights to his story. He was in the middle of a world tour celebrating his achievement when word came in about Scott's tragic passing. While they had been rivals, there was a deep core of respect between the two warriors of the unknown, and Amundsen knew well that there were many times in the journey that he could have met the same fate. It was the ultimate irony. An explorer who spent his life fascinated with the North Pole would now be forever associated with the South Pole. But Amundsen would not be satisfied with his victory. He would soon return to the North, seeking to explore it for himself, and he would be one of the first to ever see both poles. But he would meet his end in 1928 on a rescue mission in the Arctic that went down. And in the end, both of the great explorers would find their ends exactly as they lived, in the wilderness of the great unknown. Thanks for watching. For more searches for the great mysteries of the world, check out True Locations of the 7 Ancient Wonders, or watch this other video of ours instead. Thanks for watching, and as always, Take care out there.